Thanks for tuning in. Today is going to be a little bit of an odd one because there's no guest. It's just me. And so fundamentally, I want to talk about two things. The first is just want to give you a quick overview of my journey thus far in the world of podcasting. And then I want to jump into the meat and potatoes of today's episode. The plan B. A lot of people talk about the idea of leaving their country, and I thought it might be a good idea for me to just share my presentation that I gave at one of the bush bashes here in Australia. If you're considering relocating yourself or your family and all those sorts of things, there's a bunch of considerations that people need to take into account. And so the purpose of this discussion today is really to try and help you flesh out some of the things to consider and how you might go about actually doing that if you were to decide to leave wherever you are at this particular point in time. So let's begin right at the beginning. I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everyone for your support. I've been doing this Bitcoin podcasting journey for like just over a year now. And I think I should, begin by just saying a special word of thanks to Jake Woodhouse for ultimately pushing me down the rabbit hole and saying, go. The podcast rabbit hole, that is. The story goes that he delivered a presentation at one of the bush bashes in Victoria, and afterwards I came and chatted to him. It was all about podcasting, and I said to him I was keen, but I didn't think I had anything to say. And needless to say, we continued talking afterwards, only for him to then issue me with a challenge to start a podcast within 30 days. I met and exceeded the challenge by launching it within 25 days or something like that. And the rest is history. It's been one of the most rewarding journeys that I've been on. I've learned so much. I started out really green, and thank you to everyone who appeared. Thanks, Peter Dunworth, for coming on, my first guest. I wasn't even listening to your answers, to be honest with you. I was just really focused on asking the right questions. And over time, I've actually gotten a lot better at listening, understanding, interpreting, and then digging deeper. And it's something that I'm still working on, but I feel so much more confident in now. I think I'm 56, 57 episodes in, and I can't see this ever stopping. And thank you to all the listeners who have walked this path with me through bad audio, questionable questions, and everything in between. So thank you for everything. I can't say thank you enough. It really means the world. And it's been a very inspirational and exciting journey. And I feel like I'm only hitting my straps now. So that's part one of today's discussion. Let's dig into part two. All right. I feel like I have a particularly strong opinion on this particular issue, the issue of plan Bs, because I am someone who has executed a plan B. I, for most people know, am a South African. And I moved to Australia in 2018. The reason was really simple. There were just not enough economic opportunities for me. And in addition, I was faced with the prospect of physical danger. When I had someone wave a gun in front of my face and my wife's face, it just changed everything and made me really rethink everything and kind of go, I don't want to live like that. When you think about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it really is from the sort of ground up. Physical safety is really important. I mean, sure, you need food and shelter and water, obviously, but you have to feel physically secure. In the absence of that, your freedom is illusory. And so, from my perspective, I made the move. And then during 2020, my new country, Australia, decided to become the most locked down country in the world. And I was prevented from seeing my friends and family for 2 years. And it was one of the hardest periods that I can remember. And fortunately, I used it in a good way. I went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, and that was probably one of the best things I've ever done. And in a sense, I'm actually grateful, as someone who I've watched over the years, John DeMartini says, Saint Corona. It was an opportunity. And my opportunity was to discover Bitcoin. And the rest is history. 4 years later, I'm as much a Bitcoiner as ever. And honestly, I can't ever see my density shifting around this incredible technology that has so much potential, not only in terms of accruing wealth and storing value, but also just from a freedom perspective. Number go up and freedom go up. Those are two things I love the most. So swings and roundabouts, you could say. So that's a long way of saying that I actually feel fairly well positioned to be able to talk about this topic of a plan B, because I hear a lot of people in Australia and around the world talking about how they're going to leave the US, they're going to leave Canada, they're going to leave Australia because it's greener elsewhere, it's better elsewhere. And what I'd like to do is just kind of bring some perspective to the matter and hopefully be able to add some value. You might think what I'm saying is silly and you might disregard it, but perhaps there are some things that you would find within my discussion today somewhat useful. So let's begin. My general thesis, when I think about what things look like from a geopolitical perspective, is that we are going through an incredibly tumultuous time. And a lot of this is to be expected because we are going through a kind of blend of The Fourth Turning and The Sovereign Individual. These are two books that I think have been formative to my Bitcoin education. And so I think that the next decade is one that is going to be characterized by increased levels of political, social, and economic instability. And we're seeing it already. There's a lot of populism on the left and on the right, even though I believe we shouldn't be fighting amongst ourselves. It's really from the top to the bottom. It's actually the people on the top oppressing the people on the bottom. But that's a side issue. So if you're not familiar with The Fourth Turning, I'll give you sort of the TLDR, or the too long didn't read. It's really generational theory, and it's based on history just repeating itself in these cycles, which appear to be relatively predictable, and they last somewhere between 15 and 20 years. And much like nature and seasons, every generation that is born has an archetype, and the archetype lives roughly for 80 years, because that's the average human lifespan, more or less. And so, depending when you're born and when you end up maturing in your life, it will drive the mood of the nation. And so it really talks about these sort of four phases, which you could equate to summer, autumn, winter, spring. Phase one is the high. We've got an upbeat mood, there's conformity, and there's trust in institutions. The economy is going well. You can think about this as the US in the 1940s. Post World War II, we're rebuilding, the economy is going well, and there's a lot of optimism in the air. Then you've got sort of the awakening, the increased levels of sort of spirituality and rebellion. Think of the flower power and Woodstock types. That's when we started really questioning authority, and a lot of this rebellion started on college campuses. Phase three, we can look at increased levels of distrust in institutions, and there's a growing sense of individualism, the 80s and the 90s. Then you got phase four, the crisis. And then that is a revolution of some type. The older order is destroyed, and then the cycle sort of repeats itself. And so you've got the high, you've got the awakening, you've got the unraveling when there's just massive amounts of distrust, and then you've got a crisis, some sort of revolution, political, economic. And the old order is destroyed, and the cycle just repeats itself. And so, according to the authors, we're somewhat in a crisis, and this began in 2005, and this really accelerated in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. I've given a fairly poor overview of the book. It's a fantastic book. It's a dense read, but I definitely recommend it. Perhaps there's a short version you can read on Blinkist or something like that, but that's kind of the TLDR. These things happen in waves, and we're going through the end of the cycle right now. There's just massive amounts of inequality, social unrest, unhappiness, and it's evident everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're in the first world or in the developing world, doesn't matter. The next sort of piece of the puzzle, as part of my thesis, is the sovereign individual. As we've gone from being hunter-gatherers to the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago to the industrial revolution, and now we're living in an information age. And so we're no longer constrained by location, as we've transitioned from an industrial economy to a knowledge economy. And so when they talk about wealth in this book, they're not just talking about it from a financial perspective, but also wealth is the ability to basically realize complete individual autonomy, more so than ever in any society in history. It actually talks about the demise of the nation state and even goes so far as to talk about some sort of e-cash or e-currency in a cyber economy that's not controlled by anyone. I mean, it's remarkable how prescient this book was. And it was in the late 90s, I think 97, I believe, when James Dale Davidson and Lord William Rees-Mogg actually wrote this book. It says, and this is one of my favorite quotes, honestly, as our financial freedom increases, governments won't have any choice but to treat us more like customers and less like victims of an organized crime ring. So we perfected the horse-mounted cavalry, gunpowder was invented, and then basically any peasant could defeat a knight on the back of a horse. We had the mass production of books, and that really ended the church's monopoly on scripture and information. And so the summary here is just that the information revolution has, and this is underpinned by technology, of course, will destroy the monopoly of power that is held by the nation state. Just as the gunpowder revolution destroyed the knights, and just as the printing press destroyed the church's monopoly on knowledge. Okay, and so where does this all lead to? Well, I believe Bitcoin actually fixes this. And it is against this backdrop that for some of you might go, well, I knew this already. I know that things are chaotic. Fine. Let's now talk about some real solutions. Let's imagine now you're living in a place and you feel somewhat aggrieved. You think that the direction of the country is not going well. I'll point to a couple of examples here in Australia that have pricked my ears, let's just say. Most recently, we've got a digital ID that's been passed. So originally, they said, no, it's going to be completely voluntary. This is currently the state of it. We know how this ultimately ends. Eventually, it will become compulsory. If you ever want to engage in any government services whatsoever, you're going to need a digital ID. And that's something that, from my perspective, looks like planting the foundation of the CBDC. So I don't like that. The other thing is we've got an e-safety commissar, or I don't even know what the title. This is an actual person's job to monitor free speech on the internet and to protect us from ourselves. I don't like that. So directionally, I'm going, this is not looking good, Australia. And lastly, the other thing I'm not really pleased about is, and this hasn't become law yet, but discussion from serious people with power to tax unrealized gains in your self-managed super. This represents a complete and utter abomination of tax law as I've understood it. You actually need to realize gains. It's not enough that I work and I pay tax and then I go and I invest that and then I pay tax on the capital gains. No. Now I'm going to be taxed on unrealized gains. Like, how do we practically enforce that? Let's not begin to ask those types of logical questions, but from my perspective, we're going directionally in the wrong way. Doesn't mean I want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Not just yet, no. But directionally, it looks like the same. Plus, it feels as if we're importing a lot of the cultural war stuff from the US. And it feels as if we're like 5 years behind. And respectfully, New Zealand, because it's just so slow and behind the time, is probably about 8 years behind. But it's directionally there. Canada probably is just a few years behind the US. And so it does make sense to consider a plan B. In my case, it'll be a plan C. But let's now talk about, well, what are some of the things to think about? So I've given some real thought to this. And so let's just tackle them. And I'll give a little spiel about each. And this is something to think about. So the first is, okay, wherever you're going, you've got to think about the cost of living. Okay. Whether we like it or not, money is the currency. They're like lifestyle tokens, as my once Bitcoin friend Raoul Pal said. They're like lifestyle tokens. And so you've got to think about the cost of living. There's places in the world that you could go to, but what's your cost of living going to be? Then you've got to think about taxation. Is the place taxed on worldwide income? Is it territorial? Think about the income tax, CGT, GST, estate duty, sin tax on alcohol and cigarettes and whatever else. And just think about dividends tax and every other type of tax. There are all sorts of taxes around the world. And when you're thinking about wherever you're going and putting roots, you've got to think about the taxation situation. To me, that's a relevant factor. I look at tax as going, government's offering a service. Am I getting value for money in return? When I feel that there's another place that on balance offers better value for money, I'll go. The next is community. To me, this is a big one. One of the things I think that is understated and Bitcoin is a bit short on when it comes to thinking about Plan Bs is a community. It's all very well saying you want to go and pack up and head to St. Kitts and Nevis or Dominica or Dubai, wherever you might want to go. But are you going to find a group of people who are like-minded, who can think like you? And I'm not talking just rabid Bitcoiners. I'm talking about people who you can actually call friends, people who are friends who could become your family in a sense, friends who are family, they're that close. Because community is something that is really important. And so, you know, you might be able to go and save money by living in a rural town in Serbia, but how are you going to fit in? And that kind of ties into the culture. You might find a place that has maximum freedom, very low cost of living. But again, how are you going to fit in? And ultimately, and I can speak from experience, although I am extroverted, so it does mean I thrive and I get energized by engaging with people. I do want to be in a place where I can engage with humans. This is what inspires me. This is what gives me energy. And so I think this applies to all people, even self-declared introverts. I think that we need some level of community and we want to be able to resonate with the culture we're in. It is very difficult living in a culture where you're a complete foreigner forever. I live in Australia. I'm a South African. I'm always a South African. I'm an African by birth and it's in my blood, it's in my DNA. But um, Australia has been a relatively good fit. And I say relatively because I say it has been easy to integrate. Australians are different. Yes, we speak English. That's great. And that comes to the next point, language. You want to be able to at least communicate with the people that you're living with. So I say all these things because from my experience, even though Australia has got a fun culture, I actually enjoy the sense of humor, enjoy the people. It's fundamentally different. And it has been hard for me personally, outside of Bitcoin, to connect with people on a real basis. My people in South Africa are like my family, my friends, and I love them forever. But I don't know if I'm going to replicate that. And that's something to think about. People are not thinking deeply enough, in my opinion, about how important the people in your life are. Because I'm telling you, here I am in Australia, and relatively speaking, I don't have the depth of friendships within Australia as I had in South Africa. And that makes it challenging. So basically, don't underestimate how much community and a culture and a shared language can help. The next is economic opportunity. Unless you're financially independent, unless you're working remotely, you need to think about, well, what are the prospects? Mauritius is a low tax environment, as an example. It's close to South Africa, where I can get in touch with my friends and family. But what are the economic opportunities there? What can I do in Mauritius? Not that much, to be perfectly honest with you, particularly given my skill set. I don't have much capacity to earn much there. And the reality is that for a lot of people, if you're not financially independent or you don't have a business that is time zone independent, that doesn't care about your time zone, that you can just literally go anywhere in the world, you've got a business that's just paying you, you don't have that situation, economic opportunity is huge. Again, move to a tiny island and go see what it's like. There's often not a huge amount of economic opportunity. People want to go to Vanuatu. Australia is like very draconian. Well, good luck. There's not much opportunity there. You're going to have to find some sort of work online because it ain't going to happen there. The climate. Woo, this is a huge one. Honestly, I can tell you that I'm 20, 30% happier living in Brisbane than I was in Adelaide, just by virtue of the climate. There's nothing better than good weather, truthfully. And it just so happens that good weather appears to be in places often where there's economic opportunity. It can be quite a high cost of living. And so climate is something important. Again, you could go move to a place where things are very cheap, but the weather might be horrific. So don't downplay the weather. Security. I already went on a little bit earlier about my experience living in South Africa. It's the number one reason I can't live in South Africa. And if I did live in South Africa, I'd live in the middle of the bush. miles and miles from any human being virtually, because living in cities within South Africa to me doesn't feel safe. I don't want to live there because I want to be able to go for a walk at night with my dog and not worry. And so if you're going to move to a developing nation, even if it is on the rise, think about that. There is nothing more important than your physical integrity, particularly Australians. And again, I'm not giving Aussies a hard time. They don't understand what the rest of the world looks like when it comes to physical security. Like, you can't just go for a walk in South Africa at night with your dog. It just doesn't exist. You have to live in a security estate. And that's for like the 1%, if that. And so security is really big on my list. Maybe Australia went a little bit big on safety and security during COVID, but that's neither here nor there. The reality is that physical security is absolutely paramount as far as I'm concerned. What about healthcare? You might want to go and live in a far-flung part of the earth. What sort of access do you have to healthcare? And then you're not just living in an island, like unless you're a dink, which is a term that's becoming more and more prevalent these days. No kids, no jobs, those are ninja loans. Schooling is a factor. If you've got kids, you want your kids to socialize. You want them to meet other kids. What are the options? You can do it from home. That is an option. It's not a bad option, but it's just think about that. How are you going to manage that? And then infrastructure, telecommunications, and transport. People take for granted living in first world countries. I'm going to say parts of the US aside, where I think the infrastructure has decayed a lot, at least since I started visiting, relative to what it's looking like today. But like, don't take fast internet for granted. There's parts of the world where it's an absolute pain. I was chatting to someone recently, actually a Bitcoiner, and they're all over South America. And trying to have a conversation with this person is absolute hell because they can't find a good place to be able to communicate. Now, yeah, without fast internet, many of us can't do the work that we do. And so you need to understand the infrastructure and then government services, what's available. Like sometimes you get nothing, absolutely nothing, and no support. The infrastructure is crumbling and there's nothing. So think about these types of factors. So like when it comes to things like governance, you might go, oh, well, there's people speeding my road. Maybe you want to just write to the local member and just say, hey, buddy, can you maybe stick up some speed bumps? There's parts of the world, like in South Africa, and I keep reverting back to South Africa because that's my experience, where it's like the population actually go, you're not going to fill the potholes, we'll fill them. You're not going to do this, we'll do this. You're not going to offer us security, we'll get private security. You're not going to give us reasonable healthcare, we'll get private healthcare. You're not going to give us reliable energy, we'll get our own energy. Where does it begin? Water? You're not going to give us water, we'll just draw a borehole. So these are the things that people do in South Africa to be able to survive. And those are not like the majority of the population. This is just the elite. This is just the 1%. But that's what you do in a developing country that is just incapable of governing itself well. It seems, at least from like my vantage, and I'm speaking specifically to South Africa. So I don't know what it's like in other developing nations, but think about that before you sort of look at a country and go, maybe that's an option. Because honestly, visiting a place is very, very different to living in a place. And once you've lived in a place, you start realizing actually all the warts and all. So those are kind of the factors that I wanted to talk through. Now, it's all very well looking at the world as like a smorgasbord and going like, where do I want to begin? There's just the issue of accessibility. Now, some options are unavailable, like flat out unavailable. You're not going to ever become like a citizen of Japan, as an example, if you're not Japanese. But there's other options for you to live and work at places, and they're available and they range from complexity to cost. You get things where you can have the right to live and work in a country, and you might be a citizen, a permanent resident, or you just hold a working visa. So those are kind of the three categories: citizen, PR, or permanent resident, or you hold some sort of working visa. Obviously, citizens have the right to enter and leave a country. You get it by virtue of birth, by descent, or by investment, or through conferral. Like I became an Aussie citizen last year, and it was because I had done various steps to get there. I had gone from being on a temporary work permit to a permanent visa to ultimately becoming a citizen. And so those are the three main mechanisms that you can actually have rights to enter a country. Now, when you think about Australia, and I haven't done this for 2024, but when I did the presentation, Australia was ranked 6th in the world for passports. Now, that gives you access to about 186 countries, visa-free travel. You'd need a visa for some parts of Africa, Middle East, and some Asian countries. So by and large, you'll probably be fine for the most part. Now, here's the beautiful thing. A lot of your exploration can be done on the basis of just a tourist visa. So you looking at a country and you go, that's interesting. Guess what? As a South African, where my passport is ranked something in like, 60 odd, it means that, and I'm just making that number up, I haven't checked for the purpose of this discussion, but it means that I can't just visit the US. I can't just pop into Australia. I can't just go to the UK. I have to ask for permission. I have to give them bank statements and reams of information to assure them that I will be back in South Africa. And so the Aussie passport is really good for mobility. It just gives you the option to explore things freely. And in some instances, they'll have sort of reciprocal work rights or travel arrangements. And so it's a good passport to have. Same with New Zealand, same with Singapore, same with Canada, same with the UK, same with the US. These are good passports to have from an exploration perspective. All right. So when I think about what the next decade requires, as I said, to go back to an earlier point, the next decade is characterized by, I think, just more instability. And I don't think we've kind of reached there. I mean, we've still got the US elections in 2024. Like, can you just imagine what it's going to be like? I mean, literally, we got Weekend at Bernie's Joe and we got Crazy Orange Man. It's unbelievable. And everyone's going to be glued to their screen and they're going to be people burning things. And I mean, like, I'm just predicting it's going to be chaos. And it's only going to get worse. And so optionality is key. You need to have options, multiple passports and or residencies, which are different. So the passports are for citizen holders, residencies just give you the right to live and work there. And so why do you need this? Well, obviously, if I don't like where I'm at, I can just pack up and go. Like if Australia does another lockdown, I'll be like, boom, I'm gone. I'm off to South Africa. I have another option. It might not be the best option, but it's an option nonetheless. So what I would do, okay, if I were in a first world country and I'm thinking about where do I want to go, I'd go, well, where are the outliers? Who are the governments that are optimizing for freedom, whether it's individual, whether it's financial freedom? Who are the governments doing the right things? Okay. And then I would go, okay, what are the options for me to be able to acquire permanent residence, either a work visa or by investment? And look, are there any options for me to acquire citizenship by descent? Like were my parents born there by any chance? I know, for example, and again, these are just rough numbers, but like there's 4 or 5 million folks living in Ireland. There's like 40 or 50 million Irish passport holders. It's because they're very generous in terms of how you're able to get an Irish passport, whereas others are very, very strict. So figure that one out. Find out where your parents were born. And if they're born in different countries to you, there's a good chance you might be able to get a passport there. And you think, well, actually, do you know what? I don't ever want to live there. There's no harm in doing it. Just do it. Multiple passports equals absolute optionality. Like ultimately, you're going to be the one who has maximum freedom and choice. And guess what? We've got capital in the form of Bitcoin that we can take and we can fly. So I think if you want to make these decisions, you need to start by looking at your priorities. What are your non-negotiables? And what I have suggested, at least in my mind, is to have a very, very bright red line that says you do not cross this line. The minute you do this, I'm done. We're broken up. It's like a girlfriend who might cheat on you. Now, some people tolerate that. Some people even cucks. But from my perspective, that would be a deal breaker. It's like, no, I'm done. There's no discussion here. And so what is the bright red line for you? Everyone's different. Absolutely everyone's different. Okay. For me, I will not get locked down again. Absolutely not. You're not going to keep me indoors. You're not going to, have arbitrary edicts and tell me I've got to just obey them, etc., etc. You're not going to prevent me from going anywhere. Like I'm a free man. You're not going to do that again. So that's my line. And so if there's something like that happens again, I'm out of here. And so, okay, let me think. What are the things to do? Okay, because the world is chaotic. Things appear to be pretty hairy all over the show. And so it's always a question of there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, right? So everything comes at a trade-off. Let's go back to the point I made earlier. Think about all the things that you need to think about. Cost of living, taxation, community, culture, language, economic opportunity, climate, security, healthcare, schooling, governance, infrastructure, all of these different things. So then you go, okay, let's explore, are there parts of the world where I can go and I live within a country that is quote unquote technological technocracy or becoming, authoritarian or whatever. Let's call it Canada. But are there parts of Canada that are kind of wild and semi-autonomous in some sense? So I'd have a look at places like in the US, for example, Texas, Florida, Wyoming. Those are good places as far as I'm concerned in terms of freedom-loving people. You've got places that are semi-autonomous territories like Madeira in Portugal, Lugano in Switzerland. And so places that are more decentralized and freedom orientated, those are places to look at. It's not like I have to reinvent the wheel and leave the country. Maybe it's like within my own country, there's a place I can go to because I evaluated all the options. And guess what? I'm shit out of luck. And by the way, any of the options that I investigated overseas, they're not the best because the trade offs don't stack up. Then you might want to go, okay, let's talk about like countries. Okay, well, or regions. So I would say you really want to focus on places that have relative political and economic stability because that's really key. And so you've got a place like South America where it's all over the show in some parts, right? Some places that I understand are pretty wild, other parts are more chilled and relatively stable. So Uruguay has always come up as one of the places very stable politically. Um, people have spoken about Mexico as being a place for freedom. I probably wouldn't be looking at Mexico. Yes, the cost of living is cheap, but at the same time, I've got a friend living over there at the moment, and things can get pretty hairy. I mean, there's, the army are walking on the beach with guns and all this sort of stuff. I don't know. That's not kind of my lifestyle. So, each their own. Central America, of course, we've got El Salvador, which has very little crime thanks to Bukele's crackdown. And again, you might say that's great, but what happens if you're the guy who just gets arbitrarily locked up without a trial? I'm not saying I'm defending murderers and criminals and rapists and gangsters, but I'm just saying generally, I want to live in a place that's free, where there is a right, presumed innocent until proven guilty. And so think about that. In Eastern Europe, I've heard good things about Montenegro, Albania. If you're looking at Western Europe, well, it's crumbling. There's some strife, but I think Portugal is really good. It's very tax friendly, great weather, great people, great cost of living, absolutely great in that respect. And then Mallorca, I've spent some time there and love Mallorca, particularly. I'm not actually going to share where because it's a little secret pocket. And in the Middle East, you might like Dubai. Personally, not a big fan of Dubai. Or Africa. You can look at places like Mauritius or Botswana. Mauritius is very business friendly, tax friendly. A lot of South African expats go there. But yeah, you're on an island at the end of the day. Botswana is also relatively safe, but the laws are pretty heavily skewed in terms of being able to own anything as a foreigner. And then at the same time, they don't have great freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of association. Like it can be a little bit authoritarian. So it's safe, relatively speaking, in Africa, but I just prefer freedom. That's my preference. What Andrew Henderson, one of the guys I follow online, and you might want to just Google him, Andrew Henderson, the nomad capitalist, talks about like legacy brand countries, so Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, the UK. I just have a sense that they're going to grow more and more centralized, totalitarian, and directionally they're not going in the right direction. I'm looking also closely kind of at who's speaking out against the WEF, Klaus Schwab's friends and the globalists, and really where are the places that are optimizing for freedom. I love kind of what Milei's doing, but yeah, we also see him sort of cozying up to various people at the World Economic Forum. So it's hard to know what's true and what's not true, but it looks like direction he's going the right way, essentially cutting the the Argentinian government in half. So I guess there's all the considerations, right? This has been a bit of a free-flowing rant or discussion. It's not a perfectly optimized discussion, but those were kind of the main thoughts I had. For those of you living in countries like Canada, the US, New Zealand, Australia, don't take for granted safety, economic opportunity, and culture to the extent that you've lived there your whole life, and family and friends, because those things are, I think, as far as I'm concerned, the most important. And for me, moving to Australia has come at a cost for some of those issues. Economic opportunities, brilliant in Australia. It's been difficult in many ways for us to integrate into the culture, even though we're English. So those are just the things to think through. And it's only going to get more complicated if you've got a family, which I don't have at this point of time, but soon will. All right. So I had a plan A, South Africa. I turned it into a plan B, Australia. And now I'm thinking of a plan C, which I think within the next 5 years I should have. I guess I'll leave you with this. And this is not really new. There are no solutions here. There are only trade offs. There is no utopia. The grass is not always green on the other side. Ultimately, it's really a question of personal preferences. And yeah, if anyone's interested in having a discussion around this, reach out. I'd love to chat about it. I'm super passionate about it. I've obviously put a plan B in place for myself. And if you want some, assistance or guidance, I don't actually have any service in that relation, but I just love talking and helping people. So give me a shout. Ultimately, guess who's the winner here? Bitcoin. We have capital with wings. If we get mistreated by our governments, we can fly away. And that's why Bitcoin. All right, friends. Cheers.